want more time, we can wait
No,
like a little bit.
no, no, no.
Okay, great. It's going to be recorded, if it's okay with everybody, and I'm starting the seminar. Good evening to everybody. Thank you all for being here. Today, we're initiating a new round of virtual seminars with the title Distinctive Voices in IIER Masters in the Making, drawing upon the well-known 1997 book by Iva Newman and Ole Weaver. The Future of International Relations Masters in the Making, which is published by Routledge, as everybody knows, with ultimate goal to engage up-and-coming but also established senior scholars and students, most of all levels, in open, informal discussions about theories and phenomena in international relations and its subfields. This is very important in order to deepen and broaden research, narratives, ideas, and discussions about international relations in a more holistic, but at the same time more individual focus on the discipline. In this regard, the research program on the theory and practice of international relations at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, the Department of Political Science in the Justus Liebig University Giessen in Germany, and the Department of International Relations in Ege University in Turkey co-organized these virtual seminars with the ultimate goal to enhance participants' comprehension of international relations theories, global political dynamics, geopolitics, foreign policy analysis, and related domains within the field of IR. I and my co-organizers that will co-host and co-moderate these seminars, and whom I thank very much for this collaboration, Dr. Ferid Asli Erkul Jorgensen, who is Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations in Ege University, and Dr. Alexander Reichwein, Senior Lecturer in IIER at the Department of Political Science in the Justus Liebig University Giessen, wish that through scholarly lectures delivered by eminent and emerging academics, coupled with expert-led discussions, participants, primarily the students, are welcome to engage in interactive sessions that offer critical insights into the theoretical frameworks and practical applications of international relations. So we are very excited tonight to initiate this round of virtual events with a lecture by Dr. Alexander Reichwein, who, as I said before, is a senior lecturer in international relations at the Department of Political Science at the Justus Liebig University Giessen in Germany. He's conducting research on the intellectual history of the discipline of international relations, the realist tradition in IR, and on humanitarian interventions and the responsibility to protect. He is a co-editor of the book series Trends in European IR Theory, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and Dr. Reichwein holds a Ph.D. in political science from Goethe University, Frankfurt, with a thesis on Hans Morgenthau's liberal and normative German realism. So before I begin, I would like to thank, as always, Ms. Stella Migliotti and Mr. Dimitris Polalis, whose contributions to the organization of all virtual and live events of the research program are immense. And of course, the director of IIER, Professor Haralabos Tsardanidis, who is always very open, supportive, and receptive to the initiatives and collaborations of the research program. And without further ado, I will allow Alex. I think we're trying to create an informal space here, like a classroom, in order to engage as many students as possible and have like a meaningful discussion. So it would be best if we address each other with our first names, if you both agree. Alex, without further ado, I turn it over to you to announce the title of your lecture and what it's all about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everybody can see and hear me clearly and loud. That's great. Yeah, thank you for organizing this lecture series. I'm a part of the organizational team, so I'm thankful to myself partly. That's always nice. Always also to my kind colleagues, Asli, Ifi, and we are also working on a book together. It's a lot of things which are in the move, and we did organize two very successful roundtables in May and in October this year about neoclassical realism and international politics and US foreign policy. and we had a lot of very, very distinguished scholars on board. It was, I think, a very fruitful people from the US, from China, from Europe, from different parts of the world. And this lecture series here, and I think that Effie at the end will also announce the upcoming events also in this year, is another idea to meet each other twice or 3 or 4 times a year in this rather informal mode to discuss. And in this lecture series, Masters in the Making, we want to give scholars, young scholars, older scholars, distinguished scholars, scholars at the beginning of their career, it doesn't matter, interesting scholars, people who are doing interesting research. We want to give them the chance and a voice to present something, whatever this means. And we had already a lecture by Knut Erik Jorgensen about the liberal tradition in international relations. As far as I can remember, it was at the beginning of this year or at the end of last year. I'm not quite sure. It was winter. Maybe Ashley can remember too, and Effie. And yeah, today I want to tell you something about realism. And I will start with a first comment on the title, which was my choice. The Unknown History of Realism, Primarily European Tradition Emigrating to the US. Honestly, it's not true that the history of realism is unknown, because if this would be the case, I would not be able to tell you something about something which is unknown. I use this title in order to get your attention. And I use this title or these titles in order to get publishers and to get special issues published in the journals, because I think sometimes it's necessary to use words or wordings or keywords to get people's attention. It's not unknown, this history, but it's most of the time forgotten, or it's not in people's mind, or it's not that well known, maybe. So please use quotation marks for unknown in terms of that this is a wording we could, what we would not do today, we could debate about. So unknown is rather a rhetorical style I use in order to get more attention, for sure. And after listening my today's presentation, most of you would maybe argue, I've heard about it, I was already thinking about it, but maybe I didn't have all these detailed information. And this would be the best choice, or the best thing, the best case scenario for today's lecture. Secondly, I want to announce you that you do not have to listen to me now for an hour. This would be very boring, and then people will get tired. I have prepared small pieces or parts. I want to speak about different parts which are belonging together, for sure. And after each part, taking 5 or 7 minutes or maybe 10 minutes, I open the floor and you have the chance to pose questions, to ask something, maybe to start also a discussion about what you've heard. And we ask in particular the students, the PhD students, the students to use the chance and to pose questions. And the third introducing idea is I didn't prepare PowerPoint slides because I want to see you. You can see me. We want to have this interactive conversation. And I have published about what I'm talking today. And I will provide you with the chapter or with the piece, which is, so to say, the the basis of my today's talk. So you can write down something, but you do not necessarily have to because you can read it tomorrow, next week, after Christmas. It's up to you. I hope this works for our series because we have no defined format in order. You have to present a PowerPoint or you have to do PowerPoint slides or something like this. Okay. Let me start with the background of my research on realism. For those who do not know me, this is maybe very interesting. I'm not a hardcore realist because I'm not an American. I'm a German. I'm a European. And it might be that there are also people in the US being interested in the history of realism. This is my topic today. Ned Lebow is one of these guys. And I know that Ned Lebow was not only part of our two roundtables, and he was not only in Athens in the last couple of weeks for a research stay. Ned Lebow is one of these American guys who is for sure not only interested in the history of realism, he does history of realism. And this is why Ned Lebow is actually a European. He's not born in the US. And this shows that most of the IR scholars in our IR circus working on the history of realism are Europeans. Me, I'm only a small part of this group. And the American realists, they are rather analyzing US foreign policy. They are analyzing international politics. They are analyzing global or regional power shift. They are analyzing the competition between the US and China, the US and Russia, the US and whatever. So it seems to me that it's worth to make clear at the beginning that me, I'm speaking from a European perspective. And this brings me to my first point I want to make, namely the motive. Why am I doing this when I'm not a hardcore realist? I'm not sure whether I'm a realist, to be honest. Maybe I'm a constructivist or a liberal IR researcher. Honestly, I'm not sure because reconstructing the origins and roots of an ism, realism, for example, means that you use constructivist core assumptions because you speak then about the influence of ideas and you speak about the influence of agents, of key thinkers, of key figures, of individuals. And you will later this evening learn that realists actually have been liberals. And so maybe some of you are confused. And this is something you should be. Please be confused because I do not believe in this realism, constructivism, liberalism, institutionalism. Is seemingly clear distinction between these isms. I think this is not possible. And I can remember if he talked during Corona with I do not know with whom it was. It is also on YouTube. And I made the point that Andy Moravchik is not right in writing about, I know these are the realists, these are the institutionalists, these are the constructivists, and the liberalists are the best, so to say, having the biggest explanation power. So I do not believe in this kind of theorizing in international relations as a discipline, as an academic discipline. And I do not believe in this, even though I started my lecture tonight, I do not believe in this distinction between he is a European, he is an American, he is from elsewhere in the world, because, and this is one of the core points today, when you leave a place, going to another place, you always take your ideas and minds with you. And this is why realism is maybe the best example, the most clear example that a theory can walk. from one place to the other place. This is why I use the title a primarily European tradition emigrating. For sure, a theory cannot emigrate, but the people who have the theory in mind can emigrate, and they did. So just to explain why I use this title. And all this, and this is my second point, brings not only me, but also Knut Erik Jorgensen, who was already mentioned tonight, and three other colleagues of mine to the idea in 2011 in Porto, in Portugal, during the WISC conference, observing that most of IR theory is American, and observing that most of the IR theorists, contemporary, defining what realism, what liberalism, what institutionalism, what constructivism actually is, are US Americans. Observing the fact that there is a kind of American hegemony in IR. Just think about the ISA conferences, each March or February. This big conference with a few thousand of IR colleagues. And it's very, very dominated by American approaches. And then we observe that these Americans do not speak about the European origins or the European approaches, the European history of all these IR theories. And this brings us to the idea, and Knut Erik Jorgensen was the leading figure, so to say, giving his experience, giving his position in the IR community, who successfully suggested the idea of a book series about the European traditions in international relations. And one of these books is about liberalism, and one of these books is about realism. And the idea was that Europe needs to improve, and Europe means us, we. May it be Greeks, may it be Turkish, may it be French, may it be British, may it be German, may it be Scandinavian scholars, it doesn't matter. That European IR theorists need to improve their knowledge about the roots and origins and the historical development of IR as an academic discipline, including the various theoretical traditions and changes and dynamics, in order to first strengthen a European identity in IR, and secondly, in order to have a precondition, leaving this Eurocentrism or US American centrism, and starting a really global IR discourse on theory traditions in IR. Because the idea was, once you know where you are and who you are and where you do come from and where you want to go to, you are rather in a position, intellectually speaking, to open the floor. And until a couple of years, the debate about realism was a debate between US Americans and Europeans. And this has changed because in the meantime, I see a lot of articles published from people, maybe they are in the US or in Europe, but they are from the global South. And they publish a lot of articles about different realist approaches and different themes, topics, problems in international relations or in foreign policy. And it seems to me, Iffy, Asli, and all the other guys, that it is already successful that we have this rather global discourse, because we do not only explain American or European or German foreign policy. I read a lot of articles about the problems in Korea, the problems in Southeast Asia, the foreign policy of states in the Middle East. And I see a lot of colleagues being from the global South using realism as a theory to either explain international politics, power shifts, the structure of international politics, neorealism or structural realism, or explaining the foreign policies of particular states, foreign policy analysis. And this makes me very optimistic that it makes sense to do all this research on the theory traditions, because then people from global South can argue, well, we have also realists in our history, for example, in India, in China, thinking about the balance of power in the 70s or 80th century. Then you have people arguing that in their discourses, in their countries, realism plays a crucial role. For example, the power competition between Brazil and Argentina in South America. Or you have people arguing that there is a distinctively global South understanding of realism. Because a global South perspective is quite different from a European perspective, as you all can imagine. So the idea is not to do research on realism to just make the argument this is a European theory, full stop, but to open the floor. And this European scope is on realism, not only on realism, but today I can only speak about realism. But in the book series, we have a lot of other theories. For example, the English school. Connie Navari, if he was with us a couple of weeks ago in our workshop, and she did this English school book. And we had a book on feminism, and we will have a book on post-positivism and critical approaches, and so on and so forth. So about realism is today our topic. On the one hand, realism, and this is what I think is not unknown, for many people it is maybe, socialized in the US, but it's forgotten, or it was a long time forgotten, because people do not care about it. They just want to explain something, and it doesn't matter for these people whether a theory is American, European, Asian, African, or whatever. But on the one hand, you can argue that realism roots in a long and intellectual, rich and inspiring European history. We can historicize, reconstruct, and critically appraise and engage with realism, and show that realism goes beyond American structural or neorealism. What does it mean? It means that when you think about realism, you should not start in the Cold War. You can also start with Hobbes, Rousseau, Machiavelli, and all these philosophers, European philosophers, which had a very, even so basic or rudimentary understanding about realism. So there is, before you start research, and I did it a couple of years ago, before I started, I was quite sure that there is a European history or a European tradition, because otherwise it would have made no sense to start research on something you're not convinced about. So my job was to make it clear, to open people's eyes and ears and minds for this, and to work out these traditions. Because, on the other hand, I was socialized in Germany in or during my studies that American is a realist, and that realism is an American tradition. And most of my professors started with the Cold War. And I was surprised during my university time as a student when one professor started to talk about realism in a European context between the two world wars. I was thinking that this professor is wrong. How could he be a professor in international relations when he is that wrong? And he wasn't wrong. It just opened my mind. The name of this professor was Richard Ned Lebow. Just to mention this, who was those days and who still is a couple of times in Frankfurt, because he has some very close relations to Germany and also to Frankfurt. And why does this happen? That students, maybe some of the students which are here today with us, think that realism is an American Cold War theory. This is why most of the textbooks start with this story. And this story is not wrong. It's not a lie. It's not wrong. It's not a lie, but it's shortened. It's not the full, it's not the whole story. Maybe the title should be the not whole story of realism, but this is not the best wording we can have. Because these European figures, they, as Ned Lebow did as a small child, he speaks about it in public. This is why I can do it too. He wrote about it, and he still writes about it. These realist key figures, they did emigrate to the United States due to forced emigration. This is Felix Röch's um, book about the forced immigration, and you all can imagine why, because they all had been Jews. And the Jewish had to leave Europe, as you all know, in the 30s, and in particular, the German Jews. And in America, they became famous professors, and most of them became US citizens because in those times, America was an open minded, liberal society, welcoming everybody. And then I will later speak about one of these guys. I think Effie and Asli can imagine about who I will speak, but there are a lot of other people you can speak about. These realists, European realists, they became more and more American because of the daily life, because of the socialization processes, because of their academic environment. And they made career. They become government advisors, for example. Some of them became later Secretary of States, like Henry Kissinger, and security advisor, because Henry Kissinger was one of these guys. Do you know that Henry Kissinger is a German, born in Fürth? Fürth is a small city between Munich and Frankfurt. He's a Jew, and he had to leave Germany as a child. This is the whole story. And aus Heinrich wurde Henry. From Heinrich, he used to use the first name Henry. That's all. Kissinger is a very German name, Kissinger. And these guys did not speak about the German past for different reasons. I will later present you one reason. And from a today's perspective, it's unbelievable on the one hand. On the other hand, it is not, because I know in the meantime a lot of people here in Germany, migrants, refugees, who do not speak about their past for different reasons. It seems to me that this is part of the story when you have to leave something somewhere. You do not speak about your past for more or less obvious reasons. And the problem now is that these key figures, becoming Americans, had been Europeans. And this is not the problem. The problem is that in IR, in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, when I was socialized, they did not receive this academic attention in Europe. And after the Cold War in particular, they should deserve. And this is the idea of this book series, and in particular, the idea of the book on realism, which I was editing with Felix Röch together, with a couple of chapters on realist key figures, all of them Europeans, all of them Jewish, one woman, Hannah Arendt, the rest men. It has to do with the situation in those days. Today, that would be quite different for sure. But I do not want to speak now about gender or about this problem of male and female. You all know that IR theory in the Cold War was a white male academic discipline, and this has changed completely. So this is one reason to tell something about this unknown, hidden, not so well-known European history. And I have two more points, and then we make a short break, or not a break, but then I open the floor for the first questions. Another thing which makes it, in my understanding, very necessary to do research on realism and to present realism as not an American Cold War parsimonious theory about the balance of power and about some few assumptions, but rather to present realism as a European political philosophy, which has a lot to say about law, morality, democracy, populism, domestic politics, is that realism is maybe the most simplified, shortened, and misunderstood intellectual traditions in IR. It is almost always equated with nationalism, conservatism, power politics, no matter the cost. And this is not true. And a last point is that there are some IR colleagues, one is with us, Asli, who, for quite good reasons in the past, argued and published on it that realists in Europe are not visible. They are not organized. They are not um, uh, organizing a clear European realist theoretical tradition. They are not that loud in terms of intellectually um, uh, present, in terms of um, intervene into the debates. Uh, and I think this is not the case any longer because we have a standing section at the ISAPEC on realism. We had a lot of publications in the last couple of years, and we have been, and I think Asli is as happy about it as she was critical in a couple of years ago. So I think so. We have a lot of European and also female IR colleagues doing neoclassical realism, trying to explain the foreign policy of different states. So maybe you can see that sometimes the motive in this concrete case, the critic of something can inspire you to do something and to change things. I mean, the other thing is whether the critics are convinced about it, but this is another story. This is not my job to evaluate. So these are my first, not so brief and not so short, but I hope substantial ideas why I do research on the history, the intellectual history of realism, and why I have this European perspective scope, and why I do introduce all these figures which are no longer with us. And I hope I have um, made some more or less clear points on this topic. And I want now, for the first time, but not for the last time, invite you to pose questions, to ask something, and Effie can organize this.
Thank you, Alex, very much. I would like to ask Ashley if she has some comments, maybe some interventions in what she has listened so far, because before we open the floor to the audience for questions and to participate in the discussion freely with us.
Thank you so much, Effie, and thank you, Alex. As always, you have given an inspiring talk about realism, which also made me to think more about Morgenthau and a very rich history of realism, which is going back to different continents and also to different actually disciplines, because Morgenthau had actually this really rich intellectual inspiration, which started actually in Europe. And as you clearly explained perfectly, that he has actually had this very deep intellectual blocks that he got inspired from. And when actually we try to understand realism and Morgenthau, maybe we should also go more than, I mean, further than Thucydides, Hobbes, or Machiavelli. These names actually became like, you know, given names whenever it comes to talking about realism. It's very common and like a given fact for students and academics to talk about the roots and, you know, these names. But actually, Morgenthau in early 19th and 20th century as a scholar, he got inspired from especially German Machschule or these Friedrich Menike, I mean, or Italian sociologists. So Culture Pessimismus in Europe, actually he got really inspired from these intellectual blocks and the concepts that actually he put his theory on really stand on these ideas of idea of the state reason or power or his actually distance to morality for states came from actually these cultural blocks. Like if we need to, maybe we can first check German historicism. It actually influenced Morgenthau's focus on context. I mean, thinkers like Leopold von Ranke, he believed that history should be studied in its unique circumstances. And he and other thinkers in this respect, they rejected universal rules for understanding events. And like them, Morgenthau also applied this to politics, and he argued that power and conflict must be understood within their specific historical and cultural settings. So he got actually connected this historical approach and also political science and actually made it something for international relations, which is really smart. Or Friedrich Menike, I mean, he shaped Morgenthau's ideas, especially on morality and power. So in his book, Menike, I mean, the idea of Staat reason, state's reason, he discussed how states must balance ethics with their need for survival. And in his book, he argued that leaders often face tough moral choices to protect their states. And Morgenthau also, I mean, he adopted this idea and he believed political decisions often involve choosing between moral values and practical needs. And he actually got inspired from actually this idea of reason of states. Or maybe some Italian sociologists like elite theorists like Gaetano Mosca and Vilfredo Pareto. These two sociologists also influenced Morgenthau's understanding of power. They argued that power is always in the hands of a small elite, and these elites maintain control through manipulation and for Morgenthau applied also this idea to, I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit more here. Of course, there are no, it's not always like Morgenthau is writing directly that I got inspired, but when you look at into, I mean, delve into his conceptual analysis, you can actually find. But if I'm maybe wrong, Alex, please just pop in and then please just correct me here. But Morgenthau applied this idea about elite control into international politics, and he saw great powers and their leaders as the main actors in global conflicts. And lastly, or maybe not lastly, because there's also culture pessimismus here, but maybe most importantly, we should also underline German Machschule, power school. So they emphasized the role of power in politics, and this tradition associated with figures like Heinrich von Trischke and Max Weber. So they rejected the idea that politics could be understood purely through moral or ideological lenses, and instead, this understanding argued that power struggles were the core of political life, both within states and internationally. So power, according to this school of thought, is the primary driven of all political actions. So this obviously actually was the intellectual atmosphere, I mean the climate. And for Morgenthau, especially the ideas of Mahschule were fundamental, I assume, and also actually Kunuderic, because we are also writing a piece on this issue together with him. So also like its thinkers, Morgenthau believed that politics and international relations are driven by the pursuit and maintenance of power. So his famous assertion that international politics is a struggle for power directly echoes the central tenet of the Mahşule here. So he argued that no matter how noble or moral a state's goals might seem, securing its survival and increasing its power were the most pressing concerns. So this focus on power dynamics became a core feature of classical realism here. And finally, I want to include actually cultural pessimism of that era. Uh, I mean, the era of this early 20th century, culture pessimismus. This also shaped his worldview because this movement arose also in Germany after World War One, and it focused on the decline of Western civilization and the failure of progress. So, I mean, thinkers like Spengler argued that Western society was in moral and cultural decay. And Morgenthau actually shared this skepticism. He believed that conflict and power struggles are part of human nature. So as a conclusion, let me just wrap up that. So Morgenthau's ideas were shaped actually by those European thoughts and from different disciplines, German historicism, Italian sociology, culture pessimismus, elite theory, or reason of states, and I guess I didn't miss, okay, any other. So these actually made his theory really well knitted and really talking to both societies and politicians at the same time. Maybe actually this is his magic. This is the key to his magic, according to me. So that's what I just wanted to, give a huge credit to Morgenthau and his really uh, large range of understanding politics. So thank you very much. I want to stop here and I would like to give the floor to Effie.
Paulo has raised his hands. Paulo.
Yes, we have raised hands. I just want to thank Ashley for this great intervention and the knowledge that she shared with us. And I just want to make a point really quickly for those who might have the Greek students maybe who are lost in the discussion, that what Alex is trying to say with this lecture, I mean, this is my understanding, is that we have the mainstream understanding of realism. I will be more practical than Ashley in order to save time, you know. We have this mainstream understanding of realism, which is the common perception as a conservative, power-centric American Cold War theory that focuses on power maximization and national interest at any cost. And many times the main tenets of realism are confused with the tenets of neorealism, and they're actually neorealists, but they claim that they're realists. And Alex's counter narrative, which is where we should focus, is that realism is ultimately a continental European tradition with liberal, normative, and critical roots. And also it could exist in other parts of the world. We have to always research the theoretical tradition of its geographical area. And there are misinterpretations of realism as purely pragmatic or cynical, which is not the case. So this was my very, very short intervention just to ground, again to Alex's lecture. And there was indeed a hand raised.
Paulo.
I think it was by Dr. Zade, if I pronounce it right, or Mr. Zade. Okay. Mr. Binecourt, Zanerato Binecourt, I apologize if I pronounce your last name wrong. Please pronounce it for us. Or I can call you Paolo, if it's okay with you.
You can call me Paulo, that's okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's call everybody with our first names because this is the essence of the seminars. It's an informal space for all of us to discuss and learn. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Effie, Asli. Thanks, IIER for organizing it and Alex for bringing these insights on. Well, uh, uh, well, my name is Paulo. I'm a PhD candidate from Brazil, and I have these research agenda on the development of theory in the international relations field. But now I am doing something more empirical because I feel these constraints due to uh, this hegemony of empirical studies that I think has a lot to do with the mainstreaming of American IR. And yeah, so my question to Alex is, you have already mentioned that a little bit, but I would like to listen to it a little bit more. You said that being born in Europe or in America does not mean that the author is necessarily committed to developing that strand of science. They can do American IR or they can do European IR or realism in despite where they come from. My question is about an author that I have been researching for a long time now, which is Kenneth Waltz. When we go to his references for theory building, we see a very sophisticated instance compared to other American IR scholars. And when we go to these references, his references are Meineke, his references are Morgenthau, his references for theory building are Popper, Lakatos, and he's not attached to these views. Actually, he's critical of these views, presenting a conception of theory that for its time uh, is based on a South African philosopher of science, Cyril Harris, and he has all these features that brings him out of this mainstream American IR. But at the same time, he's so committed to developing his theory of international politics that you cannot say that he is not American or that he is not discussing with the debates that he's immersed into. So I would like to listen a bit from you. How can we classify such an author that does not seem to fit in either of these categories? Thank you.
Effie, are there any more rising hands, or should I answer to Paulo's question?
There are no other hands right now. Please answer to Paula, and then we can continue the discussion. I have some questions as well, maybe Ashley.
Okay.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, Ashley, you are my co-presenter tonight. I do not have to say any more to Morgenthau because you mentioned nearly all the intellectual influences of Morgenthau. That's great. So I can later jump on an empirical case, which is very interesting because Morgenthau did argue in a case you have to explain when it comes to a conflict those days, which is also today a very important conflict. And I do not need to say anything more about all these German thinkers who have influenced Morgenthau. You nearly mentioned all of these. So thank you very much. And Effie, I could not do it better to summarize what's my core idea. It's not versus, but it's rather American parsimonious neorealism and European realism as rather a political philosophy. Yeah, that's indeed the case. Paulo, nice to see you. We met each other in Lille at the ISAPEC in late August, a couple of weeks ago. As far as I can remember, yes, that's the case. So, Paulo, yeah, I'm very thankful. Kenneth Waltz is a very good example that, again, it does not make sense to use these seemingly clear categories. In Germany, we say Schubladen aufmachen, and to put someone into something. into a room and on the door it's realism and you cannot escape this room. You're always the whole life in this room. That's nonsense. Again, when I distinguish between American and European IR theorists, I do it as a kind of rhetorical trick because this makes my argument maybe much more clearer. To be honest, I do not believe in this separation because many Americans like Jennifer Sterling Fokker, Ned Lebeau, and all these guys are very familiar with European traditions and and vice versa. And Kenneth Walls is a very good idea. Let me answer to your question, Idealtyp, genau, Max Weber's Idealtyp, ne, genau. Let me answer to your question with something I want to remind everybody of you, also the younger students here. Kenneth Walls did a book in 1959, Men, State and War. And nearly nobody knows this book because in most mainstream textbooks about realism, it's always the 1979 book, Theory of International Politics. And in these 20 years, something happened with Kenneth Walls. Because as a young PhD, he was studying economics and he wanted to work in the business sector and he didn't get a job. And then he did this Men, State and War book because he was interested in this stuff. And this is until today the best explanation why there is war. What are the origins of war? The man is the individual level, the state is the domestic level, and the war is the international level. And reading this book, I see it here from my place in my working room because I'm sitting in my living room, but I can have a look through the doors. This book is a book in which he explains us Kant, Spinoza, Rousseau, Hobbes. He did read all these European realists. And then he offers a three-level explanation. Why do we wage? Why do we suffer war? And after this book, he didn't get a job as an economics professor. He was not successful. And then he decided to apply for a job at a university. I'm not quite sure, but you can read it. There's a nice book from Ole Wever and some other guys, which subtitle is Masters in the Making. And they introduced Kenneth Walls. The book is from 1999. I think it's Michael Smith and Ole Wever. And you can read it in this chapter. Then Kenneth Walls was under pressure because once he had a job at a university in the US, he had to do rational choice theory, he had to do economics, he had to do all this rational choice stuff. And then he wrote a theory of international politics. And this book is a kind of economic theory about international politics. You have causal chains, you have causal explanations. And I think Kenneth Walls is not the Idealtyp for the US American realist because he started with something different, namely with a European explanation, why do we have war? And Kenneth Walls is a very good example how you can come under pressure in your job when you're at a university and you have to teach, you have to do some things which are not on your high priority preference list, but rather on a, I have to do this. These are some must-dos. And this is my short answer because otherwise we are running out of time starting now a Kenneth Walls debate, which would be worse to do. And this is why you can identify some American, and Kenneth Walls isn't American. He has no migration background. He is an American. You can identify some American theorists which always had been interested in European history. But it seems to me that they had to do some different stuff. John Mearsheimer is also interested in European history because he knows everything about European history, because in all his publications, may it be the article Back to the Future, which is now 34 years old, or may it be his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he uses European history in order to make his theoretical bedrock assumptions clear. He uses European history as empirical verifications of his theory. But John Mearsheimer is quite different from Walls because Mearsheimer is only interested in presenting you one or two assumptions, and then he can explain everything. Why there is war in Ukraine, why there is war in maybe Taiwan someday, maybe there was war, why there was war at the Balkans. So even John Mersheimer, who is the prototype of this rational choice, American, hardcore, offensive realist, even John Mersheimer knows about European history and he knows about his European key thinkers. But I can remember I asked him in 2009 in Potsdam, Berlin, at a conference of the former ECPR, now thanks to Knut Eric, by the way, now ISA, the European ISA. Mr. Mersheimer, you know all this stuff. Are you not interested in integrating this European intellectual history into your theory? And I said, no, because it would take too much pages. I need 4 pages in order to explain you why the Berlin Wall has fallen. I need 2 pages in order to explain you why the Russian war is West falls. He's not interested in it because he has a different understanding what theory should do. And so we can also distinguish in the US community between different US American realists. And I do not want to drop some other names because otherwise we are confusing the audience. Effie, you are completely right. But there is no clear, in my understanding, no clear understanding in the US what realism is about. You can have a lot of different interpretations what realism is in the United States among US American scholars, may it be white male people or may it be in the meantime also female scholars. A lot in the meantime, they have different understanding. And so my last point, Paulo, I think that Kenneth Walls is a very good example to show that it's not possible to distinguish European and American realists. You can also distinguish within the US community different realists from each other. And this makes this tradition so rich.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Paolo, for your intervention. You wrote in the comments that Jonathan Haslam's No Virtue Like Necessity is also a very good book on that. And also there is another comment, there is a comment by Professor Chandanidis that the first chair of IR was founded in 1919, the Woodrow Wilson Chair of IR at the University College Wales. Yes.
In Aberystwyth.
Okay, great. I don't see any hands raised. If there is, if somebody has an intervention or a comment or a question, please raise your hand before I pose my question. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Okay, I have a comment. From the discussion so far, what I have gathered is that here you have realism, and everywhere realism goes, there is a cloud of misinterpretations and stereotypes above realism. And we have the scholars divided into 2 camps. So the question I'm going to pose may seem very obvious, but having in mind what Alex just said, that actually we have to come to the American realists who focus on foreign policy, power politics, and they're trying to maximize, they're the maximalists of American power. And also we have the European realists who are focusing more on the history of realism, and they're trying to figure out and redirect the research program of realism. So again, I'm saying the question may seem obvious, but I think we should research it more. And maybe with this question, we can reach some conclusions why these discrepancies and these misinterpretations exist. Why has realism been consistently misinterpreted as a doctrine for power maximization and realpolitik? And I know that there is this confusion with neorealism, but should we also blame the realists themselves that because they might have contributed to this misunderstanding? And how we can address this question? And if we addressed it, how, because we also need to examine how to take theory and ground it into empirical analysis. How can this more nuanced understanding of realism be effectively communicated to policymakers and IR students in order to jump from theory to practice? So these are questions for everybody, Alex, Ashley, our audience, just to instigate a discussion. Thank you.
Maybe I go on because my next part is addressing this question. Is it okay? Okay.
Yes, great. Yes,
great. I do it briefly in order to open the floor again. Okay. The next part is why European and why emigrating and what were the consequences. And the consequences is that you can answer to the question, if why is it that realism is misunderstood? Why did the realists not try to prevent it? And this was one of the questions. Okay. First of all, it is clear that realism is a European tradition because, and Ashley and also Iffy, you mentioned this, realism is a theory about power, yes. Realism is a theory about competition, yes. Realism is a theory which explains the origins of war, yes. It's not the only one. All other IR theories do the same, to be honest. They have an understanding about power. They have an understanding about why do we wage wars, and they have an understanding about competition. But realism is maybe reduced on this. And it's clear because in Europe, there had been wars and power competition for many, 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 many centuries. And it started with the war between Athens and Sparta. And this was the time of Thucydides, who wrote down, as you all know, the Meliere dialogue about that the balance of power would have prevent this war in the Aegean Sea in those days. And then Machiavelli was thinking about how the Italian city-states could emancipate themselves. And once they did, from the Italian ground, then they will have the power competition, who is the strongest. And Hobbes asked, how can we prevent a civil war into England? You all know these stories. And this was not possible for Americans because when America was founded as a nation state in 1776, it was by war, but this was the only civil war the Americans did experience. And America was first attacked in December 41 in Pearl Harbor, and then at 9/11. So the US-American theoretical community, they for sure was not able to develop a theory in the 17th century because in the 17th century there was no United States of America. So it's rather a very easy explanation for this. And this brings me to the next point. If you asked, why is it that realism is that misunderstood? Three explanations. These German and French, Raymond Aron, Stanley Hoffmann, these French and German and Czechoslovakia, Karl B. Deutsch, he was a Czech with German background. These people did not publish in English, but in French or in German or in Spanish in the interwar period. Because they all had been in European states. And they did publish articles, working papers on the civil war in Spain, the takeover of power by the fascists in Italy, the rise of the Nazis, the so-called Munich Agreement in order to divide Czechoslovakia into a Slovakian and in the Czech part. You all know this dark story of European history. And they wrote about the Germans' fault for the First World War and how to deal with the Germans. And they wrote about Stresemann and his successful attempt to bring Germany back into the community of cultivated, this was Morgenthau's wording, states in 1926 with all these peace agreements, and then Germany was able and allowed to enter the League of Nations, as you all know, and Stresemann received the so-called Friedensnobelpreis from the League of Nations in those days. So these Europeans, they rather did think about how to prevent a second world war. And you know that they all had not been successful. And the exote, the isolated guy was E.H. Carr, because E.H. Carr was the only guy who was not a Jew. He was the only British or English guy. He was the only guy on this isolated island. And he was the only guy who was believing in Stalin and Hitler as rational actors with whom you can make politics. You maybe know that in the first edition of 20 Years Crisis in 1939, in the preface, E.H. Carr introduced Hitler as someone, and also Stalin, you can make deals with. It's a Trumpian word. And unfortunately, in the second version in 1946, Carr did not delete the part on Stalin. He was convinced that the Soviet Union is an alternative model, economically, politically, to the liberal West. And this made Carr be isolated. He was not invited in 1951 to the grounding conference for the English school. And he was very unhappy about this for the rest of his life. Nobody wanted to talk with him. Nobody wanted to invite him because he was in the second edition of 20 Years Crisis. He was suggesting the Soviet Union as a model which should be taken seriously by the West as an alternative. And so in the first edition, you argue that Hitler and Stalin are rational choice actors. In the second edition, you argue that Stalin and Stalinism is an alternative model. Then you should not wonder that nobody wants to talk with you in the Western liberal world. So Carr is, for many, many reasons, and it seems to me that Professor Tzananidis and Paulo are rather experts about Carr. I'm not a Carr expert, but this is why Carr is not so much in this community, and he did not have to leave Europe because he was not a Jew. He was not forced to emigrate. And this, Effie, brings me now to the answer. These Jewish emigrants, may it be Hannah Arendt, the only woman in this community, may it be John Hertz, you all know John Hertz, no? And the liberalism-idealism divide. May it be Raymond Aron, may it be Hans Morgenthau, may it be all these rather unknown Jewish historians, political scientists, all emigrating to the US. Do you know what they did? They did be silent on their German past. They were silent about their European past. They were silent about their European experiences. They were silent. Morgenthau was silent that he was close with Carl Schmitt when he was a young PhD student, because Carl Schmitt was a fascist. And he was forbidden to teach in West Germany after the Second World War. Carl Schmitt did never teach after the Second World War. He just published a lot of books, very important books in international law. Hans Morgenthau did not let people know that he was a fan of Bismarck's foreign policy. Bismarck was an anti-Semite, far right-wing guy. He was a reckless, crude power politician. Morgenthau was silent about his life as a young pupil in Coburg. It's between Fürth and Nuremberg and München. Coburg was the first city who made Adolf Hitler the first citizen of the state, Ehrenbürger, in 1929. The Nazis did have the most votes in Coburg at the Reichstagswahl in 1931. Morgenthau experienced anti-Semitism. He was called Mr. Abendnebel. He made a lot of bad experience because he was the only Jew in the class. And Ned Lebow was, as you all know, a young PhD student, and he was working for Hans Morgenthau. And in one of Ned's publications, the name is German Jews and American Realism, an article in 2011 in Constellations. Read it, please. In this article, Ned, who unfortunately is not with us this evening, because otherwise he could now take this part because he is the expert. Ned did one day ask Hans Morgenthau about his past. And Morgenthau closed the door, and a couple of minutes later, he went out and asked Ned Lebow never again to ask him about his German past. Full stop. So, Effie, the answer to your question, why did the realists in the 50s not prevent that realism became this American Cold War theory? Was they wanted that realism became this American Cold War theory. Because besides being silent on their own past, Morgenthau was rather interested in getting a professorship in Chicago, and he did it. Morgenthau was interested in becoming the advisor of Eisenhower and the young Kennedy, and he made it until he criticized the Vietnam War too much. Then he was kicked out. He was fired. Morgenthau was interested in being the American Hans Morgenthau. He did not change his name. Hans Morgenthau sounds very German, to be honest, compared to other people who changed their names. Aus Heinrich Kissinger, from Heinrich Kissinger, Henry Kissinger. So some changed their names. And these European immigrants, they had been not welcomed by the US colleagues. They were rather nerved about them. Or people from Europe, they have different intellectual roots, different understandings about law, different understandings about power, different understandings about political system. They will take our jobs. They are people who are competing with us when it comes to research grants and so on and so forth. Morgenthau was experienced anti-Semitism in America at universities. And this is why Morgenthau is a prototype of all these realists who rather had been silent on their past. And Morgenthau was never ever cite a German reference in the first 20 years of his academic career. He started to do it in the late 70s when he was well established and when he became old. Then he started in an interview which was never published because he died, unfortunately, after a plane accident in Athens in 1980. Morgenthau was in this fragment of an intellectual biography, which is published in a very good book by one of his PhD students, Kenneth Thompson. Morgenthau did start to speak about his German roots at the end of the 70s. We cannot imagine what it means to deny the own identity, but he did, and he was not the only one. Felix Rösch wrote an article about it, The Master of Silence. They were silent about their past for quite obvious reasons. First of all, it was shame, because they had been the victims, the Jews. Secondly, it was a rational choice. It's better that nobody knows in America that I was a PhD student and Carl Schmitt was one of my, not supervisors, but one of my supporters. And it was, according to Morgenthau, also better not to argue in favor of a Bismarckian foreign policy. And I am not sure whether you know that Morgenthau was not a political scientist. He was an international lawyer. He studied law. And he studied law at my university in Frankfurt, at my home university, the Goethe University. Morgenthau did not only change his academic profession, he did not only change his passport, he did not only change his language because he wasn't able to speak English when he was in Germany. He spoke French, he spoke Italian, he spoke German, he didn't speak English. English was not that language here in Germany in the 20s. Morgenthau did also change his identity. And this, if we can explain why these people did not try to prevent that realism became American. They supported this development because then they felt safe, they felt integrated. We in Germany, we asked the refugees to become German, to make integration, to speak our language, to take our bureaucracy. We asked them to do something between integration and assimilation. I think it's okay to ask people to integrate themselves in the community. But what Morgenthau did was a freely choiced, voluntarily assimilation. And if he would not start to talk about his German past, and if there would be no people like Ned Lebow, nobody until today would know this, because Morgenthau was not speaking about this. Herz was sometimes speaking about his German past. Hannah Arendt was speaking about her German past in her books, the book about totalitarianism. It's a kind of trying to deal with the own past. And Morgenthau, this is my third and final part for today. I will wait until we have another break or another open floor around. I will show you by one example that even though Morgenthau was not writing about his German past, he was not citing German references, as Asli mentioned, Max Weber, Karl Mannheim, Emil Durkheim, and all these German guys. And Morgenthau was also not publishing pieces about West Germany's foreign policy or West Germany's domestic politics. He did not speak about Germany. And the reason, I think it's more or less clear. You can read it in a lot of articles. I will also um, um, give you again the hint on Ned Lebow's German Jews and American Realism, this article of 2011. And there is an example, and I have prepared this example for you, by which you can show that he was very, very consequent in being silent on his past. And this leads to a situation by which many of you maybe later will say, this cannot be the case, that cannot be true. He cannot argue that way, but he did. Again, this is my last part for today, but I hope it is more or less clear why this happens in the US.
Thank you, Alex. This was an excellent explanation. It seems to me that all these people, they fled from the horrors of World War II, and this was like a defense mechanism in order to be able to infiltrate the policy centers in the USA and contribute to the creation of a new world order, the new international order, and so forth. So based on that, coming to my second question, if you could please give us, because this is very important for the students of today, we need, history is very good and it's always good to know, but we also need to ground the theory into empirical analysis and into policy today. So how can we create a more nuanced understanding of realism, what I asked before, that it will be communicated to the policymakers and to IIER students, especially PhD students, in order to contribute to another understanding of the global order, because we have the need of the rise of a new global order. We cannot continue with the same old. So if you could please just give us, anybody, but mainly you, Alex, just in 2 sentences, if you have 2 propositions, because in my opinion, this is a very important question. Thank you.
Me or any other guy here?
Yes, you and of course anybody else, but the question is directed mainly to you, but also Ashley, if she wants to contribute, if she wants to answer this question. She has.
Ashley?
I guess first I would like to actually hear Alex. Thank you.
If I got you right, I just put the link to Ned Lebow's article on German Jews and American Realism here in the chat. And yes, Professor Tatanidis, you're right. It's also about geopolitics. Mackinder, Haushofer, Ratzel, it was a very German tradition. And after the Second World War, nobody did do this because it had a lot to do with the Nazis' idea of Lebensraum im Osten, living space in the East. You all know this ideologically driven anti-Semitic foreign policy approach by the Nazis. So realism was also in a better reputation in Germany because many governments, for example, the Nazi government did misuse this idea about power politics for their foreign policy. So this is the reason why in Germany realism is still not that well established, and people are not so many saying, well, I'm a realist compared to the US, to Scandinavian countries or somewhere else. And this brings me to this question, which is, if you rather about the contemporary politics. If I got it right, the students asked, how can realists today be successful in order to advise governments or to publish something in the hope that government people will read it to prevent war or to have a kind of guideline for foreign policy? Is this the question?
The question is that policymakers and of course IIER scholars who teach PhD students and the students get carried away, is that they should start having the nuanced approach to realism that you and Professor Liebig has. I have discussed extensively with Professor Liebig, especially when he was in Athens. This was like our Costas discussion, not only about realism, IIER theory in general. And it seems that there is a lot of misunderstanding, and in Greek universities is very pervasive. And students get, they get their PhDs and they get out there and they carry on this misunderstanding approach to realism, which is damaging also for the theory itself and its research program, but also for policy. So how can you, it's very important. You and Professor Liebig have a nuanced approach. You don't, like, for example, Professor Liebig is an adamant opposer of Waltz and Waltz's theory. So how can we create this nuanced approach to policymakers? How can we change the paradigm? Because realism is it's not about power politics only. You said it before at the beginning of your lecture, Alex. It's about so many other things. Morality, international law, international cooperation.
Domestic politics, populism, for example,
Yes,
the rise of populism.
Yes.
Okay, and it's not necessarily how can this approach reach Greek policymakers, but policymakers in the world.
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't want a big analysis, just like a couple for our students to understand that there is another approach to realism, not just what they are being taught in the Greek departments.
Yes, yes. Okay. I think very briefly, one thing which is very important is that you have people at universities teaching realism in a nuanced and in a diverse way. There is no wrong and right, because when you teach realism and you read Mearsheimer, this is not wrong, this is correct. But you should not only read Mearsheimer. You should read in a realism seminar classical realists, and there you can distinguish between Carr and Morgenthau, who did not agree to each other when it comes to the power of international law. And you then should read Mearsheimer and Waltz, because the offensive and the defensive approach was a matter of dispute between these both in the 80s and in the 90s. When it comes, for example, to the question, should also authoritarian states like Iran should have an atomic bomb, a nuclear weapon, in order to guarantee this balance of power. And then you should for sure also make clear that there are no neoclassical realists. There are American, European, and within the American and within the European community, there are people rather believing in the structural and other rather believing in the domestic or in the cognitive variables when it comes to the explanation of policy. So my first idea would be, we need at universities people, and this is the case for all theories, not only for realism, but today realism is on the table. We need people who teach realism at the universities in exactly that way, that we publish books, diverse, many approaches, many key figures, many contexts, historical contexts, and many different understandings. The second point is, we need more academic people using media, going to the television, going to newspapers, writing pieces in newspapers, discussing issues in the television. This is exactly what now happens in Germany. I had a small talk with Asli before the lecture started, that we have more and more in Germany academics, university professors, or people with a university background like me, going to the public TV channels and being invited for sure, and introducing realism as a theory which can explain something. And this is on the one hand good, because realism becomes more audience. On the other hand, they have 2 minutes time. And what can you do in 2 minutes? Nothing. So maybe it's also necessary, third and last point, to publish not only in these IR journals, but also to publish in blogs via internet, to publish via X or Twitter, to publish via different channels, that many, in particular young students using all these social media channels are at least able, they have the opportunities, the possibility, the offer to read about, in our case, the different voices, the different strands, the different approaches, call it as you want. Maybe you use a very modern language, the different camps, the different phases of realism. And then, very last point, sometimes academics make it in decision-making roles in the government. In the US, it's rather usual. In Europe, not that much, but maybe this would be a good chance when people in the governments doing foreign policy would be interested in getting advisory, because realists, and Anders Wiewel make this argument in a couple of articles. Realists are not only people who describe or explain or analyze something. Realists are not only people who, when a war is over, argue, we can explain why this war happened. Realists tend to try to give advisory to governments, say, at least in the publications. It seems to me that many realists argue from a position of a prime minister or president or a secretary of state. You can see it in many cases. In America, you have these guys. In Europe, you have these guys. And then at the end, you can only hope, Effie, and this is rather pessimistic, to be honest, you can rather hope that students, and this is the beginning of the chain, students be aware of it, and then students, once finishing their studies, maybe some of them became diplomats, some of them became people in the public realm, some of them became journalists. Then they develop this understanding, this nuanced understanding of the varieties of realism. And it's a matter of time, I think, because in the last decades, from the end of the Second World War until today, we have this academic discourse at some universities, obviously not in Greek, because otherwise it's not clear to me why you argue that many Greek students leaving the university do not really know what realism is really about or actually about. But we have for sure universities in Europe where people are very familiar with realism. So maybe it's also a matter not only of time, but also a matter of the location. I do not know, but these are my ideas.
Thank you, Alex. Just to add to that, what I was trying to say is that there is a stereotype about the ideology of realism which is being taught. It's my perception in Greek universities, maybe other universities, and the stereotype, like a whole tenets that adhere to stereotypes, not the reality of realism. For example, that realism is a manual for policymakers to maximize state power, when the reality is that realism actually warns against unwise and aggressive power politics. Right? So this is the reality. So I was trying to make the case that, we have like this whole list of stereotypes, which are actually have become the main tenets of realism, and they never care to, the scholars, the professors, they never care to search deeper and transmit the reality of realism to the students. Another stereotype is that actually realism critiques ideology. There is opposition to totalitarianism, excessive nationalism, ideological dogmatism, and it advocates for balanced pragmatic policymakers. I have made notes here while you were speaking. Students get out of the departments and they have like this misperception that it's all about power maximization, the national interest, by all means, etc. I don't want to go on and monopolize the discussion, but I'm happy that this discussion has raised hands finally. I will give the floor to Professor Tsardanidis first and then to Asli. And before that, I see that Professor Tsardanidis had some questions posed. I have to read them. His first question, one of the reasons of the development of IIER in the US is that in Europe, people who were trying to study international politics were from the discipline of international theory, UK, or from international law, Germany, France, and not from political science. So talking about power, one of the main characteristics of realism in Europe was also the geopolitical approach, Mackinder, Haushofer, Ratzel. Not a question, a comment. And I see also that there is a comment by Samet, excuse me, questions. Okay, there is there are 3-4 questions here. If it's okay with you, let's allow Professor Tsardanidis and Asli to post their questions and comments, and then I will read the comment with the questions. Professor Tsardanidis.
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I have a comment on the last intervention of Alex about international relations theories and how they try to explain foreign policy. I have in my mind Professor Mersheimer and his position on Russia attack on Ukraine. As you know, he is insisting that this was a mistake by the West and by NATO powers, and he was trying, as I understood, to argue that his theory about power, because he was arguing that Russia is a great power, is a power, and you have to be very, very, very careful with it. So what he was trying to explain for the Bucharest 2008, and he was repeating again and again and again in many seminars and lectures, that in 2008, NATO accepted accepted that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. This is not entirely true, because if you read the recent published book of Merkel, and I read it very, very, very carefully in a special chapter on Bucharest 2008, it was exactly the opposite. Germany and France tried to find a solution with the United States in order to give a message to Russians that the MAP, this is the, let's say, the pre-accession process, they will not accept that, the proposition of becoming Ukraine member of MAP, but just for a matter of accommodation, they accepted that Ukraine will become in the future. And Merkel told that to Putin next day when there was a summit of NATO-Russia. So what is my argument? Then sometimes the theorists, because they want to sell their theory and want, of course, this is natural, to be justified by the events of their theory, and I think this is the case of Mersheimer, and I have written an article in a newspaper about that. He sometimes does not say the whole truth, what happened in Bucharest 2008. And this is in danger from the side of theorists, because sometimes they are so, let's say, so close to their theory, and they don't accept some other explanation, which this explanation are coming from the fact. There are facts. We are obliged to see how the facts happen. This is my comment. Sorry for shouting, but sometimes I am a little bit nervous about that.
Thank you, Professor Tsardanidis. Ashley?
Thank you. I would like to actually say something about what first Alex said. He mentioned something about theories are not only for explaining things. I guess that's, I mean, it's more than that we need, which I totally agree with. Because I guess it also kind of an answer to Effie, your question here. Because according to me, when I'm also, I mean, like most of us here, probably teaching theory in the classrooms to my students, and this is one of the first things that I actually teach, that there's a difference between understanding and explaining. So actually, the classical realism, which was shaped by Morgenthau here, was more about also influenced by this German historicism, as I mentioned, like von Ranke or Lord Acton. It was about actually that not looking for universal explanations for things, but understanding unique reasons for events and also understanding each and every state by their own foreign policies and their presence in the system. So, but I guess this kind of understanding oriented theory got changed when actually realism migrated to America because America has a more pragmatic culture and being more to the point. So if you are using a theory, it should be for something and it should be explaining and then giving you solutions. And to some extent, it actually helps theory. Yes, it is more useful by giving structural explanations, but it also made realism lose its understanding approach and moving towards explanation. So it's more simple, it's easier, there's a model, it's a balance of power, and that's it. So it's actually, I guess, this is one of the problems why realism is misunderstood, because its roots are philosophically or principally more about understanding. But
Yes.
neorealism is more practical here.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, this is one problem, and I will actually just say something about power maximization. I will just I mean, jump to the very last. It was also misunderstood because I just drop all these things about structure, system, blah, blah, balance of power, because realism is never about war. It is about balance. It's even more peaceful than liberalism as a theory because it's about protecting the state's power. It's not about power maximization is never force maximization. It's not war maximization. It is power maximization, which is about being strategic and not go for war if not necessary. That's what Mersheimer says. And that's why Mersheimer says that to the US state, do not go to war with Russia. Do not go and waste your precious time in the Middle East. Focus on your power. So this is power maximization. I guess that's actually one of the critical points which is misunderstood about both classical realism and neorealism. And I can see that Alex actually agrees with me.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. And this is actually
Thank
the
you.
Machiavellian point of view. This is exactly what Machiavelli
Yeah, yeah,
states.
that's
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
thank you very much. Okay, I have to read the questions by Mr. Samet Kayar, if I pronounce it right. How should we understand peace in realist lens? Should it be a situation of not having a war? I guess Ashley answered that a little bit. What are the determinants of establishing long-lasting peace in practice? Are realists really realist, or should we go beyond the West and give a broader explanation of world peace and rule-based international order? Alex touched upon this a little bit in the beginning when he was talking about global IR. and how we think that by developing a European realist tradition, it's going to become a problem for the global IR theories, but actually it's going to aid them to advance their cause. I think Alex made this point in the beginning of his lecture. Would somebody, yes, Alex, please.
Yeah, thank you, Samet, for this question. This is also something by which you can make clear the difference between classical and neo and structural realism. For many neorealists, peace, and Walls is maybe, Paulo, the prototype. Peace can only be achieved to prevent the big war, because, we had all these proximity wars in the Cold War. Walls wrote about small wars like Vietnam. I mean, 3.5 million dead people. It's not a small war in my understanding, but maybe I'm too German when it comes to this assessment. That may be. So in a Wallsian structural realist sense, peace is, and this is the best you can get, the absence of a great power war, which is a nuclear war. And I mean, one of the last pieces of Kenneth Walls before he unfortunately died because of cancer was this small piece, Should Iran Have the Atomic Bomb? It was a Foreign Affairs article. And I like this article. It was in 2012. Because Kenneth Walls made the point, if beside Israel, which is a not allowed to have, but have state, if beside Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran would have the atomic bomb, then there would be peace in this region, because all three would fear an atomic attack, because all know about the second strike capability of the other. So peace in the structural Kenneth Walls understanding is a peace between the great powers, but not a peace between middle-sized or small powers waging wars, may it be civil wars, like in Yemen, may it be border wars, like in Eritrea and Ethiopia, may it be wars between South and North Korea, if they would not have been contextualized into the Cold War and in the great power competition. And when it comes to John Mearsheimer, war is always the big threat and the problem, and you can prevent war by, by taking John Mearsheimer seriously, because he knows exactly how to prevent a war, who is responsible for a war. And one of his arguments is, if all states agree about the core assumptions that realism offers, his strand of realism, namely that there are a lot of strategies to prevent the big war. And one strategy is to create buffer states, for example, between NATO and Russia. So John Mearsheimer treats Ukraine as a buffer state. And I think it's not the best way to treat societies, people, and states as a buffer state, because you all know a buffer state is something which is only which has the one and only legitimacy because it is between two competing antipodes. And I think it's, from a moral perspective, something which we should argue against. But in Mearsheimer's world, buffer states can prevent the war between great powers. And for classical realists, I mean, the subtitle of Hans Morgenthau's book, Politics Among Nations, is the struggle for power and peace. And sometimes it seems to me that people forget this peace. And Morgenthau writes that there is this prudent, strategic, moral statesman who is aware of all these objective laws which rules the world since the beginning of mankind, that these rules are timeless. But it's a matter of context, as Ashley said. So Morgenthau was arguing that when you take the historical, the cultural, the time context, when you have this in mind, then you can, as a state, also change the nature of your national interest. Timeless is that a state should pursue national interest. But what is in the national interest? It's something which can change. I mean, look at Germany. Germany's national interest was to be unified, and Bismarck did it. Germany's national interest was to let the world know that we are now saturiert, satisfied in English. This was Bismarck's way. Germany's national interest then was to get some colonies abroad, which was the rest of the best, so to say. This was the national interest. Then, when Bismarck was no longer responsible, some crazy people think that it is in the national interest of Germany to make the world German and to wage a second world war. The Nazis had a quite different understanding about what is in the national interest of Germany. And after the Second World War, all these democratic governments had another idea of what is in the national interest of Germany. So you can show by this example that according to classical realists, it is timeless that states should pursue. This is also very important, the word should pursue national interest and define it, but it's not fixed once for all what is in the national interest. And then in the classical realist world, you can prevent wars by changing your definition of what is in the national interest, because it could be in the national interest not to wage a war and rather to use diplomatic strategies to solve a problem. So being asked, what do realists understand when they speak about peace, would provoke my answer, which realists do you mean? Do you mean Walls? Do you mean Mersheimer? Or do you mean Morgenthau? Just to stay with these three guys. And we all know that there are much more realists. But these are very different understandings of peace and how to guarantee peace, how to prolong peaceful periods in world politics. So the question, what or how should we understand peace through realist lenses, is an ongoing debate, because it depends on your position, what you think, what is the best practice a state can follow, or what is in the national interest of a state when it comes to the question, should we wage a war? Is it rational? Mersheimer explains the first Gulf War that it was a rational choice by Iraq to attack Iran, because in Iran there was this domestic change when Ayatollah Khomeini came back from the exile, and it was not sure how the military will react on it. And then Saddam Hussein was thinking that this could be an open window to attack Iran. Iran. This is an argument which is made by Waltz and Walt in their famous 2003 article, An Unnecessary War, the Iraq War, foreign affairs piece. So the question cannot be answered, because it depends which realists discuss the understanding of peace and war. And this again shows the variety, the complexity, the richness, call it as you want, of the realist tradition in IIR.
Thank you, Alex. And just to add to this, that this is the importance of studying Morgenthau primarily, because he was deeply critical of ideologies, like I said before, driving ideologies that are driving foreign policy. And he was warning against ideological crusades that could lead to impromptu wars and destabilization. He was advocating for responsible statecraft, and he highlighted prudence. So, if you speak with modern day realist policymakers, they take, especially Americans, they take a completely, but of course, this is the liberal internationalist dogma. We're getting into another discussion. Alex, because we will have to close soon, would you like to make your last point? Summarize it, please, in order to close. Thank you.
Okay. One example, I mean, in my PhD about Morgenthau and other German Jewish emigres leaving Europe, emigrating to the US, and having realism in her suitcases, so to say. Yeah? I make a lot I offer a lot of examples for the German thinking in Morgenthau's minds, even though he argued and he theorized as an American. And one example by which you can show that Morgenthau was also ready and he also accepted to argue towards contradictions in his thinking is Israel and the Middle East conflict and a Palestinian state. And I mean, this is a very relevant and very important case, as you all know, not only in the last 2 years or 1 year, but it's a permanent conflict. And what do I mean? Morgenthau argued as an American professor for international politics in Chicago. He always argued in favor of nations without a nation state, that they have the right of self-determination and that it's necessary to have an own nation state. Morgenthau was supporting, for example, the Armenian community in the US, which tried to have their own nation state. Armenia was a part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and you all know there was this Turkish genocide against Armenia, and there was never an Armenian state before the end of the Cold War. No, Armenia is an own state. Morgenthau did support intellectually, academically, politically, always the fight of Algeria against France, because he saw Algeria as an independent nation, as a state with the right of self-determination, and he treated France as a colonialist power. Morgenthau did a lot in order to make clear that a Kurdish state is not only necessary, but that it's also part of this national self-determination, and that the Kurdish need their own state. And Morgenthau argued always with the right of self-determination. And you all know that Morgenthau was one of the most prominent critics of the Vietnam War, because he did see no sense in the Vietnam War, and he was afraid about the ideologically driven anti-communist movement in the US, the so-called war cabinet, Kissinger, Nixon, and all these guys. Ned Lebow did write a book and a chapter, Nixon in Hell. And he made in this chapter very clear how disappointed Ned Lebow was, because he in those days was part of this academic and political community debating the Vietnam War. And Nixon promised in the pre-election period that once he will be elected as a president, he will end the Vietnam War. And he did quite the contrary. He did escalate the Vietnam War by the bombings of Laos and Cambodia. So Morgenthau was against this Vietnam War. He was convinced that it's the national self-determination of the Vietnamese people to become a communist state. And there's only one group he denied. There was only one national movement he denied. There was only one national issue he denied, and this was the Palestinian issue. Morgenthau did argue that there should never ever be a Palestinian state. He argues that there are no Palestinians. He argued that there is no historical proof that the Holy Land is a Palestinian land. Morgenthau argued that all the Arab states in the neighborhood are hostile towards Israel. Morgenthau asked for a US military intervention in the Holy Land in order to protect Israel. And in all of the other cases, Morgenthau was against a US intervention in any conflict. Morgenthau was, and this is realism at its best, convinced that only if the US is attacked, they should use military means. And in the Israel case or the Palestinian case, it depends on your perspective. So I use both words because I'm not part of one of these two communities, even though I live in Germany, in a city in which we have a lot of Jewish and a lot of Palestinian students. Morgenthau was arguing in a radical, controversial, hardcore manner about the Palestinians, and this cannot be explained when you do not know his German Jewish background. Because, and it's as easy in my understanding, as it is complicated. Morgenthau, debating, arguing as an American professor who denied his German past, who denied his being Jewish, it does not play any role for him. In the end of his life, when he became older, he became religious. There is this intellectual biography from Christoph Frey, the Swiss colleague, first in German, later in English. And he worked out this move towards religion when Morgenthau became older. And Morgenthau was then visiting Israel, and he was for a couple of weeks in a kibbutz. This is one of these rather radical, ideological driven Jewish communities. You all know what a kibbutz is. And Morgenthau was never arguing in a religious way, and then he started to do this. And all this can only be truly explained and understood if you know the German Jewish background, if you know that Morgenthau was experiencing anti-Semitism as a pupil, as a student, as a young man. This is only to be understood if you know that Morgenthau was one of these American, German, Jewish intellectuals who were a strong supporter of Israel. This is, in my understanding, the normal thing, that you are a supporter of an Israeli state. But at the same time, he was anti-Palestinian. He was against a so-called two-state solution. You all know this, no? Famous Zwei-Staaten-Lösung. He denied nearly a Palestinian history and identity. And this, I was always struggling with this position, because this does not fit on a first view in the Morgenthauian realist picture. But it fits because Morgenthau was not a rational choice actor. He was not a machine. He was not a computer. He was a human being. And as Ned Lebeau teaches us in his articles and lectures, human beings tend to lie. Human beings tend to provoke. Human beings tend to do crimes. Human beings tend to be moral and the next day moralistic. Human beings tend to legitimize things they are convinced about, even though they would, if they would be rational choice actors, they cannot legitimize. And Ned Lebeau teaches us that these German Jewish people emigrating to the US, becoming famous public academic persons, they, at the end of the day, even though they were silent about their past, they cannot escape their own identity. And Hannah Arendt did deal with her identity by writing this famous book about totalitarianism. Adorno, have you ever heard about Adorno, the Frankfurt most famous Frankfurt University professor? He developed this Kulturpessimismus, cultural pessimism. And he was sure that after Auschwitz, there cannot be any culture. This was the way of dealing with his own experiences as a Jew in Germany and in America, and he came back to Germany. And Morgenthau's way to deal with his own past was not to write about totalitarianism. It was not to write about Kulturpessimismus. It was to write about an ideologically driven US foreign policy, which is dangerous, which is wrong, because he experienced the ideologically driven German foreign policy in the First World War and later in the Second World War. And Morgenthau's way to deal with his own past was to warn against populism, radicalism, racism in the US. Nobody, nearly nobody, did speak about his papers and chapters about domestic politics. For example, the emancipation of the Black Americans, which was for him one of the most important parts in American history, because it seems to me that he compared the destiny of many, many Jewish people with the destiny of the Black people in the US, facing racism, being tortured, being not integrated. And the way, this is my last sentence for tonight, the way he dealt with his part at the end was also to deny a Palestinian identity, a Palestinian nation, a Palestinian history, and in consequence, a Palestinian state, because he could not escape his identity, his origins, his roots. And then you can explain all the contradictions. In my PhD, I have 28 contradictions in Morgenthau's writings, not only one. But Israel is one, don't get me wrong, of the big three, because it's so problematic and difficult to understand when you have all these Morgenthauian arguments in favor of the Kurdish, in favor of the Vietnamese, in favor of the Algerian, in favor of the Armenian nation and state, but not in favor of the Palestinian state.
Okay. And I guess we see that also in his book, Scientific Man versus Power Politics, in the book that was published in 1946, where essentially he argues about, the instability of human nature and the fallacy of liberalism, faith in reason. That is not good to guide the state. So, I mean, if you read this book, you can understand everything what Alex argued about right now. At this point, I would like to ask if there are any comments, any questions. Ashley, would you like to have the last word? We had I think as a first seminar, we had an excellent discussion. I love that it was free, that we had participants. I thank Paolo for his contributions, and of course, the students and the scholars who were in the audience. So, Ashley, would you like to conclude our seminars with your
I
finishing
just like
thoughts?
to thank to Alex for this really wonderful speech, and also Effie, you, and more importantly to the audience for being with us. I just thank everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley, as well for your excellent intervention. And of course, Alex, for his this great, I should say, like lecture, speech, discussion, all his thoughts, the knowledge he shared with us. I thank the audience. And before we go, okay, please stay tuned, because on December 16th, we are hosting a great scholar from Turkey and a very good friend of all of us, Dr. Bezen Koskun Balamir. She is the president of InPolSec and a professor at Ege University. Her lecture will be about regendering international relations, rethinking women, peace and security agenda. The lecture, the seminar will start at 6 o'clock Greek time. It will be 5 o'clock Central European time, and 7 o'clock Turkish time. So I also thank very much my co-host, my co-organizers for this, the organization of those seminars. I'm very grateful for your collaboration, Ashley and Alex. And I guess we will see you next time. And if there's anything else you would like to add, we will close the seminar here. Okay. Alex, do you have a last word, maybe?
Yes, thank you very much. I had so much more and else to say, but maybe this is not the last chance and opportunity to do this. And as far as I understand, the co-organizers, including me, our plan is to offer this kind of lecture series a couple of times a year.
Not a couple of times per year. I'm sorry for interrupting, but it will be best like more, because, you know, we will organize in December, maybe we'll organize in January. Just be open to possibilities.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you are interested in giving a speech or in suggesting someone who could give a lecture, please let us know, because maybe we're also interested, Paolo, in some South American IR theorists working on realism or on any other theory. So the idea is to have more of these lectures in our series during the year. And we have some other formats, these roundtables we had in the past, and hopefully we have in the future. So
Maybe we
no
can
reason to be
convince
to be
Professor Chardanidis for a
yes,
lecture.
yes,
Yes,
for
of
example.
course.
Yeah.
Yes, of
Professor
course.
Chardanidis, we will be so honored if you could just actually join in, I mean, give a seminar in one of our actually webinars. But I guess Effie can be
Of
more in
course.
touch about this.
Yes, we will be honored and we will be very happy and we will organize it. Now it's a deal.
Mhm. You are on mute, Professor. I cannot hear you.
It's not up to me, it's up to Effie. She is
No.
the coordinator of the program.
Okay. We are going to host you. Now it's a deal and we're going to discuss
Yes,
it.
I
Thank
got
you.
it as a positive answer. Thank you,
Yes.
Professor.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for staying with us for like 2 hours. We're very grateful and also very excited that the first seminar was so successful and we kept your attention for so long. And we are looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Okay, so have a good evening, good day, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.